The year is 2008, and our hero, Little Timothy, faces an Infernape in battle. Having studied type matchups at the trainer school, he switches in his trusty Swampert to counter the fire type. Swampert dies to Grass Knot, and the rest of Timmy's team falls apart, along with his hopes and dreams. "Infernape is broken," he exclaims. "You can't counter it." While Infernape may be without true counters in the traditional sense, it is a Pokemon that is regularly played around. It has to be, as it doesn't tend to leave you much of a choice. And though it's been a while since Gen 4 was current, the concept only becomes ever more prevalent with each passing generation. The way one does a merry little dance around Infernape and others of its ilk is the same dance that one tends to take on half of Gen 9 OU. A Pokemon without counters might very well be broken and ban-worthy, but there are plenty of them that aren't. How does that work? Well, like a cool English teacher explaining why Shakespeare is hip to the youth, today we're going to the original source to explore why counters aren't everything, or the Infernape Theorem. Competitive Pokemon is built around the fact that, unlike the in-game computer, your opponent will actually switch out of a mismatch, which leads to the first mystery everyone must solve. If my opponent switches out of every KO I threaten, how will I actually KO anything? They'll just keep going to the counter. Of course, that's where all the details and complexities of the game come in. There are ways to break through even the most defensively robust teams. However, experience will quickly lead you to the second mystery, which is that Pokemon is really strong no matter what I switch in. How do I counter it? It doesn't seem to have any. Well, first we have to define what a counter is. The old standard definition was a Pokemon that can switch into another without being threatened by anything that it might use, and can threaten it back in return. Makes sense. Anyone can follow this. It's based on the whole system we learned with the starters. Blastoise counters Charizard. We can look at an example from GSC. Zapdos is an immense threat, but it is completely and utterly countered by Raikou. Nothing it packs in its standard moveset can threaten it. The closest way Zapdos can actually threaten Raikou is with the extremely ill-advised Hidden Power Ground, which still doesn't actually come anywhere close to letting Zapdos beat it. It doesn't do nearly enough damage, and Raikou will out-damage Zapdos and KO it first. However, not everything is fully countered, or hard countered as it's referred to, like the way Raikou counters Zapdos. Depending on how a battle unfolds, a Pokemon might not be in good enough shape to counter another at a certain point. Alternatively, a certain style of team might be quite offensive and can't afford to run hard counters to opposing threats. Hyper-offense teams aren't going to be slapping on Blissey so they can safely switch into opposing Draco Meters. This doesn't mean that you either have a useful counter at hand or you lose. It means that your answer to an opposing Pokemon becomes what's called a check. A check is more situational, but it can get the job done if you play well. Does it perfectly answer anything the opposing Pokemon can do? No, definitely not. Does it get the job done against a Pokemon that's difficult to answer? You bet. Take the example of Choice Scarf Landorus T switching into check Dragon Dance Dragonite. Landorus T is far from completely unthreatened by everything Dragonite can do, which is a tall task, given Dragonite's power and move pool. But in the situation where you need to stop Dragonite from Dragon Dancing up and sweeping your team, Landorus T switches in and shuts it down. So this is basically how competitive Pokemon functions. A healthy metagame has Pokemon that have both counters and checks, providing a diverse array for how its threats can be answered for different kinds of teams. A Pokemon that has no counters is of course broken and should be banned. This is how things are. Or is it? This is how the game was viewed for a long time, for the first several generations, but things started to shift during the massive power creep in Gen 4, and especially Gen 5. Power creep which demanded a new way of looking at the game, to realize that maybe, just maybe, counters aren't everything. This wasn't an entirely new concept. Any Gen 2 player could tell you how Snorlax was completely uncounterable, even in Ubers. However, that was the exception, not the rule. Power creep was making more and more Pokemon uncounterable. Or was it? Partially yes, of course, but also not as much as you think. When you look at the depths of many Pokemon's movesets, like Gen 3 OE Tyranitar, you realize that there's no one Pokemon that can perfectly answer it. Oh, but of course, it can't run all those moves simultaneously, but that's exactly it. A lot of what allows a Pokemon to counter another is set dependent. A standard Gen 3 Dragon Dance Tyranitar is completely countered by physical walls like Swampert and Flygon. However, the standard mix set completely obliterates them. Conversely, standard mixed Tyranitar is completely blanked by Milotic, save for an Ice Beam Freeze. See, even that isn't 100%, as nothing is. However, Milotic is famously very shaky into Dragon Dance Tyranitar. Meanwhile, nothing comfortably switches into Choice Band Tyranitar with good prediction. You can only check it. Even something as bulky as Donphan struggles to withstand its Focus Punch. The closest thing Choice Band Tyranitar has to a true hard counter is the move Protect, backed by healthy resist to its moves, scouting it to lock into Rock Slide, but it won't do much if your Rock resists are weakened. That brings us to another crucial point. Being able to counter an opposing Pokemon is also contextual regarding the state state of the game. If Swampert eats a hit early in the game, like Choice Band Aerodactyl Double Edge, it's far from being out of commission, but it's also no longer completely impervious to the threat from Dragon Nest Tyranitar. Sometimes the scariest Tyranitar is the one that hasn't revealed its set yet. You may have two different hard counters to two different sets, but if you don't know what it's using, you don't know what to switch in first. So you may be on paper perfect into Tyranitar, yet in battle you still risk losing a Pokemon to it. So what gives? Why are some counterable Pokemon fine and others booted to Ubers? Well, in short, it's all about the impact it has on the game. Gen 3 Tyranitar may be uncounterable on paper, but it's actually quite reasonable to answer in the team builder and in the battle, which is not to say it isn't a massive threat, of course. Like every Pokemon, T-Tar has downsides, and those downsides tend to hold it back from completely demolishing everything. However, this does not mean every Pokemon is fine just because it can be checked, which is something that is often overlooked, but it is crucial. We can look to the existence of the Anything Goes tier for proof of this. Mega Rayquaza was so lacking in answers, it was banned from Ubers, which is a metagame famous for being light on counters and checks alike, which tends to happen when you're housing the strongest Pokemon in the game. You don't exactly comfortably switch into Kyogre, you play around it instead. Basically, you check it. Even checking Mega Rayquaza was too tall of a task. The metagame literally didn't have the tools for it. On the one hand, the ideas of Pokemon without counters is why competitive singles has a system of bans, which is to keep it competitive. If it is impossible or near impossible to switch into a Pokemon safely, it's not good for the game, as it tends to dilute the impact of skill in the game and overly warp everything around such an element. Something having a grand total of one safe answer or being answered by Pokemon that are otherwise too niche to have general use isn't healthy. Sure, you can counter Mega Rayquaza with Eviolite Porygon 2 in Auras Ubers, but seeing as Mega Rayquaza obliterates quite literally everything else and Porygon 2 does quite literally nothing else in Ubers, this does nothing to change the unhealthy dynamic that Mega Rayquaza's presence creates. Your choice is to either use a bad Pokemon or to get crushed, because even checking it was immensely difficult thanks to Delta Stream and Fantastic Bulk, which is, alongside Absurd Stabs, was differentiated from the equally powerful and much faster Deoxys attack. On the other hand, when you really look at it, there are a lot of Pokemon that are impossible to truly counter. Not everything is Mega Rayquaza, but not everything has to be. Gen 5 OU was where this concept really took flight, so we'll look at some examples there. Rotom Heat seemed to answer two monstrously broken Pokemon allowed at the time, Genesect and Tornadus Therian. Crucially, it answered them without being vulnerable to their common partner, Dugtrio. However, seeing as Rotom Heat was Stealth Rock weak, didn't heal reliably, and got trashed by most of the rest of the metagame, it effectively did nothing to quell the brokenness of these two. So what distinguishes them from something like Kyurem Black, the box art legendary that dropped into OU, despite melting the bulkiest steals in the game with Choice Band Outrage, making it uncounterable as all get out. While Genesect and Tornadus Therian had their flaws, they still warped the game around them, whereas most teams would naturally check Kyurem Black without even trying. The difference between Gen 5 Tornadus Therian and Kyurem Black is a pretty big gulf though. In many generations, where it feels like every other threat in OU is uncounterable, it can be difficult to draw the line. In fact, even the most skilled, experienced players often disagree. Consider the example of Gen 6 Hoopa Unbound, which was eventually banned for the destructive power of its Choice Spec set. To many, this was clearly a broken Pokemon. Impossible to counter. It's gotta go. However, to others, the ban of Hoopa Unbound was a knee-jerk reaction to a Pokemon that, while strong, was significantly flawed in the ways that made playing around it as reasonable as many other wall breakers of similar strength. This was a Pokemon that, at base 80 speed, wasn't particularly fast, didn't boast a particularly set of resist, was absolutely obliterated by its quadruple weakness to one of the most common moves in the game, U-turn, and was so physically frail that it effectively had a pursuit weakness despite being dark neutral, which was especially bad seeing that both its stab moves invited Tyranitar in, and it greatly feared Weavile as well. But again, it's not so simple. Hoopa Unbound is kept in check by Pursuit. So what of teams that don't have Pursuit? Well, it tends to destroy those pretty badly, should their pace be any slower than that of no switch, always boost or attack hyper offense. Is that reasonable? One could certainly argue it wasn't. Similar arguments were made against Kyurem Black and Gen 5 OU, a Pokemon which came to be universally considered not broken. Notice though that neither side of the argument is contingent on how Hoopa Unbound had any counters. The game had long since evolved past such a notion. Similar arguments can be made for many other Pokemon on both sides of the ban do not ban line, that they should or shouldn't have been banned because of how much they did or didn't warp the metagame in attempts to handle them. The arguments around Hoopa Unbound were incredibly similar to Gen 5 OU Latios, for example. While there's been plenty of contention against similarly threatening Pokemon like Volcarona, whose auto-win playstyles ignores apparent weaknesses like Stealth Rock and potential counters to it, forcing opponents facing it to get any damage they can to chip it across the generations. Earlier, we mentioned the massive power creep of Generation 4 as being foundational to the shift away from the more traditional view of Pokemon having counters. In a world of the physical special split, Life Orb, and new moves like Close Combat that made massive base power, coverage, and reliability a regular sight, you were much more hard-pressed to hard counter everything. This spurred a newfound insistence on banning Pokemon, a concept which would have been unthinkable in previous gens. But it wasn't just that Pokemon were difficult to counter now, it's that they were reaching levels of danger so quickly that even playing around them posed a much greater challenge. You couldn't so easily avoid losing to them by getting good. Dragon's Tyranitar in advance was light work compared to dealing with Swords Dance Garchomp, which wasn't overwhelmingly strong with a perfect stab combination and an incredible speed stat, but you couldn't even revenge kill it with its biggest weakness, an ice move, because it held the newly added Yacht Berry. You could know exactly what it was running and it'd mow you down anyway. Okay, in this case the no counter thing is pretty clear. Garchomp's ban at the end of Diamond and Pearl was a defining moment for the generation, which would end with the ban of another dragon, Salamence, whose overwhelming nature came not just from its sheer power, but its unpredictability on top of that. The answers to its mix and Dragon Dance sets were vastly different, and at worst, it would deal immense damage to just about everything, while at best, it would win the game. Having said that, Mence wasn't without its flaws. Whereas much of the threat from Garchomp came from its incredible typing that made it Stealth Rock resistant and Sand immune, as well as packing amazing natural bulk, Salamence was Stealth Rock weak, Sand affected, and not especially bulky hindrances, which were all exacerbated by the additional recoil of the Life Orb that it often relied on to reach its full one-hit KO potential. Still, whether it was using Draco Meteor, Outrage, or both, Salamence was peerless in its destruction of OU. So Salamence brings us to 2 points of comparison. First, Gen 5. Nothing really changed for it there. It wasn't any less uncounterable. In fact, it actually got even scarier by gaining Moxie as its ability, which would eventually launch it as one of the scariest choice scarfers in the tier. Ferrothorn came around to take dragon moves, sure, but it was even more vulnerable to fire moves than Skarmory had been. Now, Salamence was still quite good in Gen 5 OU, but broken? Hardly. Why? Because the metagame around it was much faster, much stronger, and thus much better at checking it. Whether it had counters or not was besides the point, and it was an identical story for Hydreigon, dubbed the new Salamence upon arrival. Can you safely counter it? No, not at all. Can you play around it? Of course. The second point of comparison is our case study for this video. Another Pokemon that had ripped up Gen 4 OU since the days of Garchomp all the way to Salamence's ban and beyond. Infernape. Infernape is famous for not having any counters, yet even at its best, it has never even come close to being banned. So why is that line so clear here as opposed to Salamence? In fact, many of the ways one could describe Salamence also apply to Infernape. It threatens one-hit KOs against a great portion of the tier, and could quite easily run away with the game. In many instances, Infernape was even scarier than Salamence. It was neutral to Stealth Rock. It was much faster. Back in the day, it even left the obnoxiously fast Garchomp in the dust. It even had 2 devastating stabs. Oh, and its move pool, which was as bursting with destructive potential as it was expansive, that's what really ensured that nothing could safely counter it. It wasn't just unpredictable either. Even knowing exactly what was coming was little help against its onslaught. This goes back to its most eternal iconic set, the classic special Mix Ape, which in addition to the famous Skarm Bliss busting stabs, packed Grass Knot to insta-drop Swampert, nearly do the same to Hippowdon, and seriously damage Suicune, and Hidden Power Ice to slash through Gliscor, Flygon, Dragonite, and yes, when they were allowed, Salamence and Garchomp. In classic Mix Ape's heyday, there was little mystery as to what it was going to do when it hit the field. Your so-called counter would be switching between resisted hits and hoping it wouldn't predict you once before wearing itself down with its Life Orb. It was a similar story when physical Mix Ape came around, with a fully EV-invested Close Combat that tore through Vaporeon, which had been popular as an answer to classic Mix Ape, since it withstood the less invested CCs and was light in weight enough to make Grass Knot do pittance too. Now, Vaporeon's time as an Infernape counter came to an abrupt end. This new Mix Ape also packed Stone Edge to rip through Gyarados while maintaining a hit on Salamence and Dragonite, and either Mach Punch to prevent revenge kills from Extreme Speed Lucario and Scarf Tyranitar and Heatran, or U-Turn to completely ruin Latias and Starmie. It's been said that U-Turn alone tends to make Pokemon uncounterable, since if you switch out against a Pokemon using U-Turn or another switch move, whatever your answer is immediately gets forced out by a new threat. This has been a major factor in the bans of several Pokemon like Pheromosa, Cinderace, and of course the aforementioned Genesect and Tornadus Therian. Infernape embodied this beautifully, especially when it eventually went all out physical with Choice Band. It could always just play it safe with U-Turn, and unless you got lucky with Poison Point Nidoqueen, you weren't going to punish it. Plus, threatened as it was by Fire Blast, Nidoqueen wasn't exactly a great switch if Infernape was running its classic mix set. Indeed, Choice Band's extra muscle made it even more difficult to withstand, even when players came to expect protect that set, prompting all manner of awkward switches to try and guard their Starmie from U-turn. Without sacrificing something else should Infernape just launch a stab. Such awkward switches have always been a common component of the experiencing of facing Infernape, but while Infernape didn't rely on surprise, it could only get scarier with it, and it could actually summon that surprise quite easily if it desired. There was little more horrifying than using Protect to scout Choice Band, or generally get some Sand Chip, only for Infernape to nasty plot in your face, or Swords Dance if it's so desired, or even worse, you make one of those defensive switches to a Pokemon that doesn't actually beat Infernape, but resists one or more of its moves, so you can finish wearing it down with Sand and Life Orb, only for it to slack off the damage, which also works beautifully against Protect. Heck, Infernape just holding Leftovers as its item can be enough to ruin such strategies. Oh, and it also chose to drop Gyarados with Hidden Power Electric on a fair few occasions. It could mix and match just about endlessly. We haven't even mentioned how ruthlessly efficient Choice Scarf sets were as late game cleaners, leaving its usual revenge killers, Scarf Flygon and Rotom, in the dust. While it was so fast, it even outran Agility Sweepers, Empoleon, and Metagross, as well as Tyranitar that had managed to grab 2 Dragon Dances. Finally, for all Infernape's concerns of getting worn down too quickly, sometimes this could work in its favor, as if its Blaze ability activated, the Fire Stab that it unleashed would become even more dangerous, torching neutral targets and making it difficult even for Resist to switch in. The breathlessness of Infernape's offensive potential is staggering, so why is it that it's nowhere near the Salamence treatment? Well, it's easier to play around by far. Not easy, but easier. Well, that doesn't necessarily have to be a deal breaker, as Salamence was ludicrously tough to play around. Tornadus Theorem wasn't quite as broken as Genesect, but it was still broken. So what makes Infernape easier to manage, despite being the poster Pokemon for uncounterability in the generation that really introduced the concept as we still know it now? Well, to keep with the men's comparisons, it struggled to hit the field safely more. It's not that much frailer, but Salamence had an Earthquake immunity alongside a fighting resistance and Intimidate, meaning it actually had some common points of entry. Infernape doesn't really have an equivalent. It is also less of a one-hit KO machine. While it's got coverage for just about everything, it's not dealing the same kind of raw damage that Salamence was dishing out. Remember, Draco Meteor and Outrage were almost never hitting for super effective damage, meaning all of those insane KOs they got were against neutral targets. Infernape can struggle to threaten something like a healthy Zapdos or Rotom A in the same way. Well, depending on the set and circumstances anyway, but it's generally tough. That ties into what it really is though. While Infernape has superb set variety, it has a higher cost of not being able to run everything at once. This is not to say Infernape doesn't do a great job of threatening pretty much everything anyway, especially with halfway decent team support. It's incredibly common to see it alongside Pursuit, for example, because it absolutely does. However, it is much more manageable in this regard, and in comparison to Salamence, because of that raw power and what its stab was much more capable of threatening everything, no matter what set it had. Infernape's got to navigate lower power and more resist to its stabs, meaning it relies more on coverage, meaning it can't help but be limited by what it can include. Of course, the 4 moves it has can potentially be the most devastating thing ever for a particular matchup, or many of them even, and remember, the opponent doesn't know what set it's running at first, so they could go to Gliscor trying to sponge Banded U-turn, only to get melted by physical Mixed Apes Life Orb Overheat instead. Although it is impossible to hard counter Infernape with one answer, other metagame conditions prevent it from destroying everything, to a certain extent anyway. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Soljiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine, for their major support of our videos.